The letter informed me that my roof-mounted solar array violated Section 12 of the Cedarbrook Landing Architectural Guidelines, exceeded the maximum permitted roof coverage for auxiliary equipment, and would need to be fully removed within 30 days or face escalating daily fines. I want to be honest that reading through it, I felt something closer to quiet amusement than genuine concern, mostly because I happen to know, with a certainty very few homeowners in that situation would ever have, exactly what Section 12 actually said and exactly why it existed in the first place, since I was the one who drafted it. My name is Percival Hendricks. I'm 59 years old, and for most of my career I worked as a land use attorney specializing in drafting governing documents for planned communities, the kind of unglamorous but essential legal work that produces the actual bylaws, covenants, and architectural guidelines that homeowners associations spend decades afterward interpreting, arguing over, and occasionally, as I would soon discover, misapplying entirely. I retired 6 years ago and moved into Cedarbrook Landing specifically because I drafted the original governing documents for the development myself, roughly 15 years earlier, back when the property was still raw land, and the developer had hired my firm to put together a complete set of architectural standards before the first house was ever built. I want to be clear that I never mentioned this particular detail to my new neighbors when I moved in. It never seemed especially relevant to casual conversation at the mailbox, and I genuinely had no reason to expect it would ever become relevant to anything at all. That expectation changed entirely the afternoon I installed a modest rooftop solar array, and received, within 3 weeks, a formal violation notice citing a provision I had personally written into that document a decade and a half earlier. I want to explain the actual history of Section 12, because understanding it matters enormously to everything that unfolded afterward. When I drafted the original Cedarbrook Landing Architectural Guidelines, solar energy was a considerably smaller consideration than it has since become, and the provision addressing auxiliary rooftop equipment had been written broadly enough to cover satellite dishes, antenna arrays, and similar mounted fixtures, establishing a maximum coverage percentage intended to prevent a roofline from becoming visually cluttered with equipment, while explicitly carving out an exception, in language I remembered writing quite specifically, for renewable energy installations meeting then-current state incentive program standards. That exception existed precisely because the developer, at the time, wanted Cedarbrook Landing to appear forward-thinking and environmentally conscious in its marketing materials, and had specifically asked my firm to ensure the architectural guidelines wouldn't inadvertently prohibit exactly the kind of solar installation residents might eventually want to add. I remembered drafting that carve-out clause personally, remembered the specific back-and-forth with the developer's marketing team about wanting to advertise the community as solar-friendly, and remembered, with the particular clarity that comes from having actually written a document rather than merely read it, precisely where that exception sat within the broader provision. The Cedarbrook Landing Homeowners Association president at the time of my violation notice was a woman named Marguerite Osterhaus, who had held the position for just over 3 years. I called the association office the same day the letter arrived, reaching Marguerite directly after a brief hold. "Mr. Hendricks," she said, once I'd explained why I was calling, "the architectural committee reviewed your installation and determined it exceeds the permitted coverage threshold under Section 12. I understand solar panels have become more common, but our guidelines do establish clear limits on rooftop equipment to preserve the community's aesthetic standards. I'd like you to read me the full text of Section 12, I said. Including subsection C, there was a brief pause, the kind that told me she was retrieving the document rather than reciting it from memory. When she finally read the relevant language aloud, I listened carefully and confirmed that it matched, almost word for word, what I remembered writing over 15 years earlier, including the renewable energy exception that, based on everything she'd told me so far, the architectural committee appeared to have either overlooked entirely or chosen not to apply. "That subsection," I said, once she'd finished reading, explicitly exempts renewable energy installations meeting state incentive program standards from the general coverage limitation. My installation qualifies under that exact exception. I want to describe Marguerite's reaction, because it followed a pattern I imagine plays out in homeowners association offices with some regularity, though rarely, I suspect, with quite this particular twist. "I'm not familiar with that subsection specifically," she admitted after a moment. "I'd need to review the full document more carefully and get back to you." I offered at that point to explain something about my own background, mostly because I sensed the conversation would move considerably faster with the full context available. "I should mention," I said, "that I drafted these architectural guidelines myself back before the development broke ground. I'm quite familiar with the document's original intent, including why that renewable energy exception exists in the first place." The silence that followed lasted several seconds longer than the previous pause had. I called an attorney friend of mine the following week, a sharp, still practicing colleague named Perpetua Alderidge, who I'd worked alongside for years before my own retirement, mostly to get an outside, objective read on the situation, rather than relying entirely on my own admittedly biased recollection of a document I'd written a decade and a half earlier. "I want your honest assessment," I told her after explaining everything, not just my own memory of what I intended to write. Perpetua reviewed the full document carefully, comparing the violation notice against the actual recorded text of Section 12, and called me back within a few days with an assessment that matched exactly what I remembered. "Your recollection is accurate," she told me. Subsection C explicitly exempts qualifying renewable energy installations from the general rooftop coverage limitation. Whatever the architectural committee's internal review process looked like, they either never actually reviewed this specific subsection or reviewed it and decided to disregard it, neither of which reflects particularly well on how carefully they're actually applying their own governing documents. I want to explain what I did next, because it reflected a certain professional curiosity I couldn't quite resist, the same instinct that had made drafting these kinds of documents satisfying work throughout my career. I requested, through a formal records request Perpetua helped me prepare, copies of every architectural violation notice the Cedarbrook Landing Committee had issued over the preceding 3 years. Curious whether my own situation reflected an isolated oversight or something more systematic. What came back, after the association's own bylaws mandated response period, which I noted with some professional satisfaction they'd actually followed correctly this time, revealed a pattern considerably more troubling than a single misapplied subsection. Of the 11 solar installation violation notices issued over that 3-year period, all 11 had cited the general coverage limitation without any reference whatsoever to the renewable energy exception, despite every single installation, based on the accompanying permit documentation, appearing to qualify for that same exemption I'd written into the document specifically to prevent exactly this kind of blanket enforcement. I want to be fair to Marguerite and the architectural committee in one narrow respect. I don't believe anyone involved set out deliberately to misapply the guidelines maliciously. What I suspect happened, based on my own decades of experience watching how governing documents actually get used once the original drafting attorney moves on to other projects, is considerably more mundane. Someone, at some point over the preceding 15 years, had likely created an internal committee checklist summarizing the coverage limitation without ever including the exception clause, and that simplified checklist had then been used, generation after generation of rotating committee members, without anyone ever going back to the actual full text of the document itself. That explanation, while considerably less dramatic than deliberate misconduct, didn't make the practical harm to 11 different homeowners, myself now included as the 12th, any less real. Several of those residents, according to the association's own compliance records, had actually removed or scaled back their solar installations rather than fight a violation notice they had no reason to suspect was improperly issued. A detail that struck me once I fully understood it, as a genuine and unnecessary loss for people who'd made a reasonable, permitted investment in renewable energy, only to be told, incorrectly, that they had to undo it. I want to describe one particular conversation that stayed with me throughout this entire process, because it illustrated exactly how much unnecessary cost this simplified checklist had actually caused. A neighbor of mine named Winifred Aldis, 2 streets over, had removed a considerably larger rooftop array roughly 18 months earlier after receiving one of those same 11 violation notices. At a removal and storage cost she mentioned, somewhat ruefully, had run her close to $4,000 once the contractor fees were factored in. I remember being frustrated at the time, Winifred told me, when I stopped by to explain what I'd discovered. But the committee seemed so confident about the coverage limitation that I never thought to question whether they'd actually read the whole document properly. You assume when a board tells you something is against the rules that they've actually checked the rules before telling you that. I found myself explaining, somewhat apologetically despite having had no role whatsoever in the committee's actual enforcement failure, that the exception she'd never been told about had been sitting in the document the entire time, drafted specifically to protect exactly the kind of installation she'd been forced to remove. Winifred's reaction, a mixture of relief at finally understanding what had happened and quiet frustration at the unnecessary expense, became one of the more persuasive pieces of context I brought to the board meeting that followed, since it illustrated plainly that this wasn't merely an abstract paperwork discrepancy, but one that had cost real homeowners real money based on guidance nobody had ever properly verified. I requested a meeting with the full Cedar Brook Landing Board, rather than simply resolving my own individual violation notice quietly, because I felt a certain professional obligation, given my own role in drafting the document at the center of this entire situation, to make sure the broader pattern got corrected rather than simply allowing my own case to be resolved, while 11 other homeowners remained under a misapplied restriction. The board meeting took place about 3 weeks after my initial call with Marguerite, and I want to describe it plainly rather than dramatically, since the actual proceeding involved considerably more careful document review than heated confrontation. I brought my own original drafting files, preserved from my years in practice, showing the developer's specific request for a renewable energy exception and the language I'd crafted in response, alongside Perpetua's independent confirmation that the current committee's enforcement practice conflicted directly with the document's actual recorded text. Marguerite, to her credit, didn't attempt to defend the committee's enforcement pattern once the full scope became clear. "I want to be honest," she said, once I'd finished presenting the history. "I don't believe any of us on the current committee had ever actually read this document in full. We inherited a summary checklist from previous committees and simply applied it without verifying it against the original text." A board member named Cassius Delgado, who'd served alongside Marguerite for just over a year, asked the question that seemed to capture the room's shared realization. How many homeowners removed panels they never actually needed to remove, based on a checklist nobody ever bothered to check against the real document? The board voted that same night to formally rescind all 11 prior violation notices, to reach out individually to each affected homeowner regarding potential reinstallation and any reasonable compensation for panels that had been prematurely removed, and to commission a complete review of every internal committee checklist against the actual full text of the governing documents, ensuring nothing else had been similarly simplified into an inaccurate summary over the preceding 15 years. Marguerite remained on the board, having handled the situation, once confronted with it, about as constructively as anyone reasonably could have. And Cassius took on the specific responsibility of overseeing the document review process going forward, working alongside me on an informal advisory basis, given my own history with the original drafting. My solar panels remain exactly where I installed them, fully compliant under the exact language, I wrote into Cedarbrook Landing's governing documents 15 years before I ever imagined I'd personally need to invoke it. I found, since all of this settled, a rather satisfying kind of professional closure in the whole situation. The particular pleasure of watching a document I spent considerable care drafting finally get applied the way it was actually intended. Once someone took the time to read the entire thing, rather than relying on a shortcut summary that had quietly drifted away from the real text over a decade and a half of committee turnover. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether your own HOA has ever enforced a rule that turned out not to say what everyone assumed it said. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this.